What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. We have got a good one for you guys today. Is the RB0 strategy the worst draft strategy in season-long fantasy? We'll take a look at what the data says, but also discuss some theory and some reasons why maybe you need to think a little bit further past the data. This video, like all the Wednesday videos, relates to a study I did over the offseason, 770,000 teams sampled over the last 7 years. And if you want any more information on where that data came from, how it was cleaned, all that stuff, watch the first video. That'll be linked in the description. Also, you can go see a full write-up on the website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. So, without further ado, let's hop into this one. I'll start off by just briefly going over basically what the RB0 strategy is and the reasons that people use it. So the RB0 strategy, theoretically, right, has been used since the beginning of fantasy. People just didn't really start using it a ton until 2013, and it didn't gain a lot of popularity as like a mainstream strategy really until 2015 and 2016, because in 2015, it started gaining popularity and it crushed that year. It did phenomenal. So everyone starting in 2016 wanted to use it, right? Because basically anyone in 2015 that used the RB0 strategy won their championship. Pretty much a lock to win your championship in that year. And so whenever that happens, people are going to jump on board. The idea is basically that the running back position sees a very high rate of injury, and it's also the most likely position to be replaced. Elite quarterbacks, tight ends, wide receivers have a chance of being replaced, and by replaced I mean like a backup starts to outperform them. They lose a lot of that workload, but it's such a small chance, right? If you're a tight end going the first 5 rounds, you're not just straight up being replaced. Quarterback first 5 rounds, not being replaced. Wide receiver, it can happen, but it's very, very unlikely. For those players to bust, they have to get hurt. And when you look at the running back position, that's not necessarily the case. We have seen times where running backs in these early rounds, there's a backup that gets a lot more work than we were expecting. And so you can kind of take advantage of this when coupled also with running backs just getting injured at a higher rate, and those injuries or for a longer average period of time. You can kind of combine all these things and say, well, why don't I load up on wide receiver, quarterback, tight end in these early and middle rounds, and then I'll target pass catching backs in the later rounds. I'll target handcuffs if you're telling me that running backs get injured at a higher rate, that their injuries are more like long-term. Well, then I want their handcuffs. And if I can build a team that just crushes everywhere but running back, and then get these handcuffs or these guys on free agency in the trade market that really, really outperform what you would have gotten them in the draft, and I can get them for cheap and add them to this incredible team, I built a super team. And we saw the possibilities of that last season. Cordero Patterson, Elijah Mitchell, Chuba Hubbard, Rashad Penny, a few others that were able to string together, a good chunk, different amounts of time. I would say Elijah Mitchell and Patterson were like the main two for the success of this strategy. If you were able to get one of them and hit on just one running back in the draft, your team probably did very well. So it's really just finding those players, and each year it's going to happen. Those were kind of, the biggest names last year. And for the strategy to work, you need a few things to happen. Number one, you have to hit. That should be very obvious, but I at least need to say it. You can't just implement the strategy and be like, well, I drafted wide receivers, tight ends, quarterbacks early. They're obviously all going to work out because these positions are easier to predict. They're easier to predict, but they're not locks. There's still plenty of busts that happen at all of those positions in the early rounds. You still need to be successful in drafting those other positions, and then after that, be successful at the running back position. The whole point is you get extra chances, but like if you went into the last year and you drafted like Hopkins, Waller, Lamar Jackson, Allen Robinson, you lost, right? You had a good chance. I mean, those are good players. On average, they probably perform much better than they did last season, But again, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to hit on your wide receivers in the early rounds. So it's nice, in theory, you should have amazing players besides running back. In practice, it's still difficult. You still need to hit on those players. The second thing that needs to happen is you kind of need running backs to fail in general, especially on the high end. The strategy isn't going to work in a year where 3-4 running backs have 23, 24 points per game, because you're not going to have any of them. Most likely it's, pretty unlikely if guys are averaging 23, 24 points per game that they're available in the later rounds. Even when rookies break out, even when handcuffs break out, it's relatively rare. You're going to need that to happen from a running back in the first few rounds. And if it happens for, 3, 4, 5 running backs, you're just not going to win doing RB0. It means the early running backs hit. Those teams have such an edge over you. You're not going to win. But if something happens like we saw in 2015, where only 6 running backs scored over 200 half PPR points compared to 13 last season, you're gaining an edge because everyone else is going running back early, and they all didn't work out, and your picks did work out. And if you look at that 2015 season, the 6 that scored over 200 fantasy points, only 2 were drafted in the top 15. So it's another thing to your advantage if those higher performing backs are on the lower end of ADP. And I keep bringing up 2015, not only because it's the most recent season where it's just been successful to go with wide receiver, go with tight end, all this stuff early, but because it's the only season in the last 7 years where this strategy has worked on average. RB0 builds have, on average, produced a negative championship rate over expectation in every single season since 2016. 2015 was the last time it provided a boost. On average, the strategy reduces your championship rate by 28%, which is twice as bad as the next worst strategy, which happens to be quarterback in the first 3 rounds. RB0 does not work on average, or does it? This is where we need to be kind of like true data scientists and understand the context behind the data and really think about why the results are so negative. Because if we just look at the numbers, which is what a lot of people would do, we would see this and say, you can't possibly go RB0. It grades out over the 770,000 teams over the last 7 years, including 2015, as the single worst strategy to implement. Teams perform significantly worse on average. However, the vast majority of ESPN leagues, which is where the data comes from, are not buy-in leagues, and they're mostly casual players. These are people who are signing up for free. These are people who are joining with their friends. These are people who are, getting bullied into joining a league, maybe if they don't even want to. And because of that, we can assume that plenty of the teams in this sample are drafted from people who either did zero research or, for sure, a lot of these teams have never heard of the RB0 strategy. Not have they researched it and know the in and outs of it, have literally never heard of the RB0 strategy. Why is that important to understand? Well, imagine back to your first season playing. Let's pretend that your buddies ask you to join a league. You agree because, you're going to be watching some of the games with them on Sundays. And you're like, yeah, well, why not? Right? I'll join your league. You show up to the draft and you start just taking people near the top of the rankings that you've heard of. Let's say it's last season and you start off Travis Kelce, Diggs, Lamb, Lamar Jackson, Adam Thielen, Kareem Hunt. That's a pretty good start, right? You're sitting there like, those are good names, right? I just drafted a stud tight end, a stud quarterback. I've got all these wide receivers that I know. Kareem Hunt's a good player. Now, not a bad start. And honestly, some of those names worked out. Kelce was a tight end 2. Diggs was 7th. Lamb was 18th. That's not bad. But if you've never played before, if you haven't researched strategy, you don't know how important the running back position is. And so your best running back ends up being Kareem Hunt, who finishes 48th at the position. And you didn't know that you did an RB0 build by approaching the draft like that. And you needed to be targeting elite running backs early, be targeting them in the trade market. And you just didn't know that. It's very likely, especially because RB0 teams historically will start out a little bit slow as you try and find that running back. That should just make sense logically. You've abandoned a position for a while. You lack the value there. You know, long term, you can make up for it. You can find someone at some point in the season, by the end of the season, have that position figured out. So you're going to peak late. But if you peak late, I mean, you're starting a little bit slower. And again, if people don't know about the strategy and they start implementing it without really knowing, just drafting players they know, they might start off 1-4 and then give up. Because also, RB0 is difficult to pull off. Even for people who understand the strategy, they're still going to fail plenty because it's difficult. It's not easy to predict which breakout running back is going to happen in the later rounds, to be able to even get them early in the season, to trade and buy low. Like, we like to think we're well above average at doing that, but it's still difficult. It should go without saying that it's not easy to have predicted Elijah Mitchell and Cordero Patterson last season. And so my guess is that the strategy itself actually does work out far more often than the numbers show. It's just that inexperienced drafters likely make up a good chunk of the data. And because also RB0 drafts tend to start out slower, like I said, while you're like figuring out the running back position, when you mix those two things, an inexperienced player with a high chance of starting slow, you're going to lead to a lot of people giving up, being like, oh, I'm not going to win this league. I'm losing every week. This isn't as fun. And it tanks the overall success of the strategy as a result. So then where does that leave us? I have done this video every single season since 2015. And to be honest with you, the results are much better than you think. Pretty much every year, people absolutely hate the RB0 team. I've historically just posted, here's an RB0 team, here's a non-RB0 team. Let's see what happens at the end of the year. And honestly, RB0 does win more often than not. It's a really good strategy, especially if you're drafting early in the offseason, because you can capitalize on significant value at the running back position that's not necessarily there come late August. But it's performed pretty well because we're pretty good at finding late values, and we're exceptionally good at finding, buy lows early in the season. So I personally am perfectly fine with anyone who wants to draft RB0. I will show you a team on the screen now. I went into just ESPN ADP, drafted a team. This is, some values in here, some spots actually I reached a little bit ahead of what ADP is, but this is just an example. This is not a model that you should go out and just draft this exact team. This is an example to show you what you could do with an RB0 build. So pause the video if you really want to look at that in depth. I will list off the team for those of you listening on Spotify, which I highly recommend doing, especially if you're listening in the car, at work, at the gym, whatever. You don't want to use much data. But here it is. Full PPR, 12-team league, 8th overall pick, ESPN, which again is what most people play on. Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, Mike Evans, Kyle Pitts, Mike Williams, Courtland Sutton. That's the RB0 start. That brings you through 6 rounds. Yeah, 6 rounds. Start off round 7. Miles Sanders, Russell Wilson, Tony Pollard, Chase Edmonds, Melvin Gordon, Nyheim Hines. Go back to wide receiver, grab someone we love, Jahan Dotson. Back to running back, 2 late round flyers we feel good about, Darrell Williams, Zamir White, draft a defense, draft a kicker. That's an RB0 build. So again, I'm more than okay with using this strategy despite what the average data says in it being the worst. However, you need to follow 3 rules that I'm going to outline now. Number 1 has to be full PPR. I would never, ever in my wildest dreams use this in a standard scoring format. It is a terrible, terrible strategy in standard. And personally, I would lean away from it in half PPR. If you meet the criteria of rules 2 and 3 and you're in a half PPR league, you can do it. It can still work out for you. You just really need to be hitting on the last 2 we'll talk about. So rule 2, 4 wide receivers. You have to be able to start 4 wide receivers. That doesn't mean 4 wide receiver spots. It means either 3 wide receiver spots in a flex, 2 wide receiver spots, 2 flex. If you're in a half PPR league with 2 wide receiver spots and 1 flex, I just would not use this strategy. You can only start 3 of them. You're really hurting your team by banning running back for that long. Running back is a significant portion of the scoring there, of the value of your team. But if you're in half PPR, you can start 4 wide receivers. Then if you hit on the third rule we're going to talk about here, you can do it. But ideally, full PPR, ability to start 4 wide receivers. Third rule, and probably the most important rule, you need to be getting value early. The entire point of different draft strategies is that they're strategies. It doesn't just lock you in when you're going into a draft saying, well, Nick said RB0 was fine, and so I'm going to do that in this league. No. You need to go in with a set of rankings, an understanding of how different strategies work, why they work, how you can implement them, but with an open mind into exactly what you'll do. Take my last Underdog stream, for example. We built a team on there, and I in no way intended to start off the draft 2 running backs and then 2 tight ends. I cannot imagine that the average advancement rate of a 2 tight end, 2 running back build to start off is positive. It is absolutely negative on average. But I was getting really good value in those spots. I did not like the value I was going to get at wide receiver, and I knew how I could finish the draft to make it work out for me. I drafted 2 total tight ends when typically it's best to draft 3, but I went with 2 early, so that gives me 1 extra spot. I went with 2 running backs early, and so I only ended up with 4 total. That gives me extra bonus spots as well. I got insane value with Mahomes in the 5th round, and then I hammered wide receiver. We know the data shows that if you put together a lot of high variance wide receivers, you can produce really high-end numbers on average because they're going to hit in different weeks. And if you give yourself 10 chances at that, you're going to do pretty well. But I was able to implement this because I knew the strategy. I didn't chase wide receiver when there was no value. I took what was there. I figured out how to build a team that used my start to my advantage. And that's how I'd implement RB0. Don't go locked in with this strategy. Go into the draft with an open mind. And if people are reaching on every single running back they see, which is absolutely possible to happen, everyone loves running backs early, and there will be leagues where incredible runs happen at the running back position, especially 1st and 2nd round. Use that to your advantage if it happens. Take the insane value at wide receiver, at tight end. Take big value at the quarterback position if it ever presents itself. Remember, we don't prefer quarterbacks in the first 3 rounds, but 4th round, 5th round, 6th round, 7th round, 8th round, 9th round, wait for a really good value at quarterback and build a team that dominates at the non-running back positions. Then attack running back late. Take handcuffs, pass catching backs, running backs in ambiguous backfields, rookies who maybe not everyone's all over, but whose upside we simply don't know. We've seen them in college, but we haven't seen them necessarily in the NFL. And so they might just be better than we think. And then follow through with the strategy in season. If you start off 0-1, 0-2, and you're clearly struggling at running back, understand that that's common. That is going to happen many times in an RB0 build. Know that going in and know what you need to do. You have to be putting in free agency bids, high bids for running backs that break out, especially because typically that happens early in the season when we didn't know guys would have the role that they do. Utilize the trade market. I'm going to be posting buy low candidates every single week. Use that. You probably have incredible depth at wide receiver. Use that. Target teams who need help at wide receiver, but don't give up, because then you're going to be part of the metric in here that's, tanking the results of people who started off slow and gave up. And if you do this, you're in a PPR league. You can start 4 wide receivers. You get insane value at wide receiver or tight end early on, and you remain aggressive in season. I can promise you that the negative 28% championship rate can be thrown out the window. You will have a better than average chance of making the playoffs and advancing to the championship. So that'll do it for this week's breakdown. We've got a really good one tomorrow. Mike Williams versus Michael Pittman Jr. versus Deontay Johnson. So make sure you subscribe and check that one out. That's a decision that I've faced a few times. I know many of you are going to face early on this season. So please make sure you watch that video. And also, check out the rankings. Check out the draft strategy articles on the website. There's more research than I can show in these videos. And I know a lot of you are going to find those studies incredibly interesting. So check that out at the website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. That, my friends, is the end of this one. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting the like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.